Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould's new book, The Valediction, Nights of Desmond, is a novelized memoir about America's involvement in Afghanistan, which began in the 1970s as an obsession to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. Paul and Liz entered this saga as journalists and witnessed firsthand how our involvement became a neoconservative cause celebre and the CIA's largest covert operation in history, which is now undoing not only the American empire, but also the concept of empire itself. Let's start at the beginning. How did you two meet?
I went to Boston University in the fall of 1969, and I was warned by my high school advisor. BU was a hot spot. It was the largest contingent of students for Democratic Society in the United States. And I thought to myself, I don't even know what the Students for Democratic Society is, quite frankly. I was offered to play football at Boston University, and I was also a singer. I sang in a number of rock and roll groups, and I had sung as a boy soprano in the Boston Opera Company. So I had a professional background in that as well. And so anyway, I get there, fall of 1969, and I'm on the track team and becoming a freshman and immersing myself in the city life, the nightlife, the clubs. You could get in for $5 cover fee and stay there all night. It was just a wonderful place. So came to the end of the first semester at Boston University, last day of school, I get called to the office of my faculty advisor. He said, what do you think of the Vietnam War? And I said, I don't think we're going to win it. So he said, well, you're not opposed to American policy and America putting itself out of the world. I said, no, not particularly. I said, I think at the time, I said, I think we're a force for good, but I don't think the Vietnam War is a very good example of what we can do as a country. So he said, oh, well, have you ever considered working for your country, for your government? So I thought, what an odd thing to say. Well, he is my faculty advisor, but he's not exactly a recruiter, is he? So anyway, I said, well, the funny thing happened. I read in the Boston Globe this morning that they're doing auditions for the Boston production of Hair. I said, they've got, it's a New York show, but they've got productions all over the country. And I said, I love the music, and I'm a singer myself. So I'm going to go down. I signed up to go down and audition for them. And they were so busy, they couldn't even see me for 10 days. I mean, everybody in, I think, the Eastern United States was auditioning for that particular show. So the time came, I did my audition, and right after New Year's, and they said, don't cut your hair. And it was like, I don't believe this is happening. They kept calling my house and saying, all right, we got another audition. They let me in the show. They hired me for the show, and they gave me the lead. I played Claude in the Boston production of Hair. And there's a big controversy in Boston. Boston's very conservative, and so was I, quite frankly, at the time. But I was like, I considered myself to be kind of the mediator between conservative Irish Catholic Boston and the world that was changing at the time. Just the way the world is changing now. Well, it was really changing at that particular time. So anyways, the reviews were good. The show went on. It was a big success. We were sold out from March until September. And then I met this beautiful young lady backstage.
I was going to Emerson College. I was going for a communication degree, and it actually was a theater school. And what happened was an awful lot of my friends auditioned for Hair, but it turned out that my roommate's best friend from New Jersey actually was dating the company manager of the show. So when the preview week opened up, I was invited, by my roommate to join them. So my first encounter with Paul was actually sitting in the audience when he comes on stage to sing Manchester, England, England, which is his first song. And I was quite smitten. I immediately could tell this was a very attractive man. But that was about the extent of it. I thought probably every, lady in the audience was thinking the same thing. So because of my friends, I went backstage and I was sitting, and at some point I'm waiting for my friends. Paul walks by and we meet eye to eye, and I'm like, that was interesting. We didn't say anything. There was just sort of a sense. Okay, so that would have been January. Okay, and all kinds of things happened between January and June before we really decided to take the next step. And in fact, Paul had activities during that period that I wished I had been a part of, like that incredible concert that you went to, that you guys went to.
We were asked to perform. There was a protest. There was the second largest protest in New England history against the Vietnam War on Boston Common. The whole place is out there. Abby Hoffman does his routine about the John Hancock Center and how John Hancock was an American patriot, and he didn't run an insurance company. And so anyway, I get up to the stage. We're next after they finish. I get up there and everyone's sitting down, and I went, "Stand up, please." And 60,000 people stood up at that moment to sing the Flesh Failures and Let the Sun Shine In.
Yeah.
Okay, which was for your audience that isn't necessarily familiar with it, it's a very dramatic ending to the show, where you see these people who are in turmoil, state of turmoil, over what's their country, their loyalty to their country, and what's going on in Vietnam in their names, and it is. And so the Flesh Failures is, we starved, looked at one another short of breath, proudly walking in our winter clothes, wearing smells from laboratories, facing a dying nation.
It was incredibly profound.
And it was just really, and I mean, I had people come up to me, people that were in the military afterwards, and said, you really got to me with that. We had people email us just a few years ago that he had seen, we did an article about it, and he had seen it, he had seen the show back in 1970, and he was in high school, I think he said, and he said, "You influenced me to become a doctor internationally." He said, "And I've spent my entire lifetime in Ghana or someplace, in a mission in Ghana, helping people." And he said, "And I've never regretted it. So thank you." So this is the kind of thing that we experienced.
My roommate, who knew a lot of the cast as I did, we had a party. Paul was one of the ones who came. But we ended up sitting in the front of my apartment all night in his car talking before he left. And it really wasn't until my birthday, July 5th, 1970, that Paul made a 2-hour trip from, after working all the weekend, to come up to celebrate my birthday in New Hampshire, where I was vacationing with friends. I didn't really know if he was going to be there or not. And I'm in a chair listening to Crosby, Stills and Nash song, Country Girl. And as I am listening to the crescendo of the end of the song, Country Girl, will you be my, that kind of thing. And I'm listening to this, and it's really just overwhelming because I have the earphones on. Suddenly, I notice a figure there. It was at the end of the day, and it was, where the sun is shining through, and it was a blinding sun. And all I could see was the figure of a male. That was it. I just knew it was a man standing there, but I couldn't see who it was. And, when I finally stopped and took the earphones off and looked, I couldn't, it was literally as if he walked out of the song.
You've got to have timing, Bruce. You really do.
But that ended up eventually leading to, obviously, the year. And I got involved. I actually ended up doing catering and helping out with the Saturday in between shows, according to
the year of the performances, right?
Yeah. The first 6 months we were not dating. It was the second 6 months, and that's why. But that really got me far more involved because I was there, meeting Paul all the time. So
Liz is a kind of chef extraordinaire.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I got involved with the cooking.
Lucky cast. Good.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So, but the thing that was so amazing to me, because coming out of Emerson, we had a huge anti-war movement coming out of Emerson. So that was part of the reason that this was such an incredible experience, because all the kids I knew, we were doing street theater, against the Vietnam War and stuff like that. And here we end up in the most powerful expression of our generation, being able to participate and to feel that we were really engaging in something that was authentic and real and powerful. And we were changing the world for the good and for our future and for our children's future, who obviously for most of us didn't exist yet, but we knew it was something for the good. And the inspiration.
Could you chat for a second about Hair's impact, how popular the show was? Please talk about that for a minute, if you would.
It was immensely popular, and it was literally a social movement. It was really, we were participating in all of the marches and whatnots that were happening at the time, and that was all during the invasion of Cambodia and these various things that were happening, and it was real. So we were kind of like a point of contact where people would come in from the suburbs or watch the evening news and then come see our show and then see us singing about those things and talking about them. And the show is very topical. You had conversations in the show that were kind of off the cuff. You'd have sit down at a coffee table in the middle of the stage and start pretending you were Walter Cronkite or pretending you were Humphrey Bogart and talking about what you would do today, if you were involved in the public affairs.
And it wasn't just a Broadway and a Boston thing, right? It was in many cities.
Oh no, it was all over the country.
It was international.
Yeah.
No, it was a show in Tokyo, a show in Paris, a show in London, show in Sydney, Australia, LA, Chicago.
One of the things, by the way, to make a very special point, this show was so special that literally local kids were put in the show who had no career record at all, practically. In fact, a wonderful story we have is one of the kids was a cab driver who drove the casting people from the airport to the auditions, and apparently he must have sung for them because he ended up being asked to come in and do an audition. He ended up as Paul's understudy. So that gives you an idea.
That was the kind of raw talent that they were pulling from, and it just worked so well, and everybody loved it.
In 1970, this would have been August, I think, a Boston City Hospital had a benefit performance in the parking lot for the patients and for the employees. And about half the cast came and they sang, I don't know, about 7 songs. And the last song, of course, as always, is Flesh Failures and Let the Sun Shine. It was an overcast day. And when it came to Let the Sun Shine, literally the sun came out. It was as if there was some kind of call between the nature of the world we live in and its voice coming in. And, everybody, responded, to that sudden, I was in the audience watching this. And so that was in 1970. Well, this actually was filmed, at the time. 10 years later, we get a call from Paul's Aunt Marge, who worked for a doctor at Boston City Hospital. And she had been approached by the son of the man who had filmed the Hair concert. He delivered the film to her and she got it to us. So we end up with this film 10 years later. Eventually, we reconnected to it in 2016, long after we had wondered and questioned whatever happened to the anti-war movement that was so powerful back then. And that was part of the passion that we felt, because that nightly viewing of the Flesh Failures and Let the Sun Shine and seeing these audience. And the thing that was amazing too was you had so many different generations who were completely mesmerized by the power and the message that was especially delivered at the end. And people would run on stage. It was, just a burst of energy. They wanted to, have contact with what had just happened. As we moved through our life, the big transition, of course, was when Paul was in his singing career in New York and decided to come back to Boston.
I went to New York and they said, we'd like you to play Jesus. And that's when I had this amazing dream, a 3-dimensional dream. I woke up in the middle of the night and I saw this. I thought I was in the clouds. I thought I was dying, or I had died. And there was this woman, 100 feet tall, standing in the clouds. In her right hand, she held 3 black horses who were rearing back. And in her left hand, I was waiting to see, which I thought she was going to lift her left hand and beckon to me to come. And I said, oh, I've died. This is it. This is my death dream. So the hand comes up like this, but instead of going like this, she goes like this. And out of the palm of her hand comes this red triangle like lozenge, dancing around and dancing around, dancing around. And I said, oh, this is like a heart. I'm going to grab it. This is tangible. I'm going to grab it. And as I grabbed it, I woke up in my room, but the heart was still there. It was still bouncing around in front of me, 3-dimensional. And so eventually it just simply turned to dust, turned to sand, red sand. And I went, oh my God, somebody sent me a message. So I realized at that point, I accepted the fact that my course was not in New York City, struggling to become an actor or performer. My course was back home. And it just turned out that there was somebody in my family who was running for political office that year. So I said, well, I've always had an interest in the politics, and I've been on kind of that side of it anyway in a lot of cases. So I think I'll just put some time into helping him get elected. And so that's what I did. And that was by 1976, that was the world we were living in. And things were really changing. 76 was a pivotal year. Vietnam had ended in 75. Gerald Ford had taken over for Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had left the White House in disgrace.
And Congress was starting to investigate some old assassinations.
Yes, exactly.
And exposing CIA skullduggery of epic and breathtaking proportions.
Right. Church committee hearings, and you had all kinds of things pouring out.
Oh my God, Watergate. I mean, we had so much.
And I was just fascinated by that.
Yeah. And you know, and to be honest with you, looking back now at the time, just like with the Vietnam War, we all thought these were really powerful signs that we were progressing, that their transparency was coming, and it was being worked through, and people were being held accountable for things that were done in secret that shouldn't have been done.
And the Washington Post was really doing good things by getting in there and getting the dirt on Richard Nixon and all the terrible things he was doing. And that was kind of that was the belief system. We totally believed in the system. We totally believed that it was working on behalf of the people of the United States.
The cracks really formed with the Kennedy assassination. Yes, the edifice still believed,
yes,
but the fissures were just starting to really.
Absolutely. Not just that. My God, look what happened with the assassination of MLK and Robert Kennedy.
Yes. But those investigations of the 70s still was a performance of a lot of hope. It looked like all the checks and balances are.
Absolutely, yes.
Government was working 5 by 5, and all you had to do is just dig down deep enough, and you'd get the answer that you wanted to get. And so that's where we were in 1976. And being a Fitzgerald, around here is kind of like, it's a double-edged sword. Because
around here up in Boston, where you
around here up in Boston, one of my relatives, my father's grandfather's relatives, was Honey Fitzgerald, who was the mayor of Boston. He had been the mayor of Boston, kind of a notorious Boston Irish politician.
And grandfather of the president, John F. Kennedy.
So my grandfather and JFK's grandfather were closely related.
Right.
Same part of Ireland, as it turns out, which factors into the story, and certainly factors into a later part of the story that we're going to tell in the Valediction. We got very political in 1976. And we did get the person in my family elected to Congress.
Ed was the one, Ed Markey.
So after that, I decided that it was time to ask Elizabeth if she would be my wife.
So 1977.
1977, we were married. And
started working together. That was actually the formal working together on productions and on the ideas that we had.
And we knew we were politically simpatico, and career-wise, she filled in the things that I didn't know, and I filled in the things she didn't know. That was around that time I said, well, I really think I could do something in television. So let's see what I can find for a television job. The Christian Broadcasting Company opened up a branch in Boston, and I thought to myself, how unlikely that
Pat
Robertson's 700 Club Christian Broadcasting Network should open up in Boston. And I went over and I said, I'm looking for a job. And they said, what can you do? And I said, well, what do you want me to do? I said, well, we need a public affairs host for a weekly television show.
Many people today may not remember, but there was something called the Fairness Doctrine. And the television stations were obligated to put other viewpoints on when they put an established viewpoint on.
So I went in and they were lovely people. I enjoyed working with them.
And in 1976, President Jimmy Carter is elected president, basically effectively on a peace platform. It's supposed to be a time where we're moving in a new direction with the Soviet Union. The Vietnam War had been a financial and moral and a belief system catastrophe for the American intelligentsia and the American people. And that was all part of what we were, looking forward to. Since we had obviously the involvement with Ed's campaign, we had a lot of direct involvement with what was going on in Washington, and it eventually led to them airing a very anti-SALT treaty and détente and anything to do with the Soviet documentary.
The SALT treaty was, was before Congress. They'd already passed one early on, and this was the second version of it.
To de-escalate any tension with the Soviet Union.
Right,
Exactly.
right. And
Got
there
to
was
calm the
both.
Cold War down, eliminate
right.
the risk of nuclear war.
The technology was racing ahead. I mean, you had this thing called multiple independent reentry vehicles, where you could put one rocket up and then it would split into 10 and then fire into 10 different places at the same time.
Was it also the era of the neutron bomb?
Yes, during that time period as well.
So
Yes.
Where it just kills people, but it maintains property.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. So this was all part of
The real estate bomb,
again, a continuation of this belief that as difficult as it was, we were coming out of the fog of war. Okay,
Yeah.
as Robert McNamara's wonderful documentary talked about, and that there were really good signs. And when this documentary was run on Christian broadcasting and gave us an opportunity to put our thoughts together, because we felt it was very important that the SALT treaty move forward and that détente be maintained. And
So the documentary exposed that the Carter administration, which kind of came in as a feel-good kind of peace platform, was blocking a nice peace measure like the SALT talks.
Well, they were not necessarily at that time blocked, but there were interests trying to force them
to
stop it. Okay,
and they were dragging their feet.
Yes.
They really weren't taking a very aggressive attitude about getting SALT passed and about extending détente.
Yeah. There were those in the Democratic side of the issue who were very, very dedicated to pushing détente and pushing the SALT treaty, which had already been approved, which had already gone through 3 administrations by that point.
And there were other Democrats who weren't.
And there were those who really were very dedicated to destroying any kind of relationship with the Soviet Union that resulted in any kind of lessening of tension. So that was always a tension that was there. That was all part of why, when the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan occurred in December 27th, 1979, we were so attuned to a level of reality that was present in the entire system in this whole movement. And we literally witnessed what appeared to be a disillusionment of the concept of peace and negotiation. And it happened overnight. I'm not kidding. It was as if the media was in on it completely. The tone, everything had been determined, how the narrative was going to be presented to the American.
It changed overnight.
Yes, in fact, there's a guy named Gary Sick, and he was in the Carter administration as an intelligence guy, and he wrote a book a few years back, and he said Afghanistan changed everything. It was the trigger, literally.
Yeah.
There had been a lot of things that had been sitting on the shelf, a lot of ideas that had been bandied about. Remember, Carter came in and he said there was a malaise in America. Okay, well, the malaise had to do with the purpose. I mean, they had this enormous defense structure. They had been built up during the Cold War. They built up during World War II, and then the 50s and the 60s, and now we're into the 70s. What are you supposed to do with all this stuff? They needed the Soviet Union to do something. There had been a struggle inside the intelligence community from the very beginning.
Right.
You had straight intelligence, you had military intelligence from the Navy and from the Army, and then the Air Force about who was doing what the Soviets were doing, okay? But then you also had the political people who wanted to politicize the intelligence. And that had been a battle from the very beginning of the intelligence services, but they had they had been able to draw a line to not politicize things to the extent that they would corrupt the narrative in terms of what was going on.
Well, they would corrupt the information.
So,
at least the president knew.
This is what Team B did. Team B, this is in 1976, was a very ultra-conservative, pro-military, pro-defense buildup group of people who came forward and said, everything the CIA is doing about the Soviet Union is wrong. We're right. How do you know we're right? Because we say so.
That's it. That's the end.
It was a faith-based analysis of what was going on, but it had an enormous amount of power, enormous amount of influence inside the institution, because the institutions were all kind of geared towards the next step, the next big step. So what was that going to be? And that's where Zbigniew Brzezinski comes in, and Zbigniew Brzezinski says,
Provides it,
I have the next step for you.
right?
But
Okay.
he came in with Carter as his national security advisor.
Right,
Exactly.
and
Basically, he led Carter in terms of foreign affairs, no?
well,
Yes, completely.
it's hard for us to know for sure at what level Carter actually
Acquiesce.
really knew or acquiesced. We have no way of knowing that, but he absolutely gave Brzezinski carte blanche to set up whatever he wanted. He came in January of 1977 prepared to literally start the provocation, which eventually led to the Soviet invasion in 1979.
And they were
at the
real
end.
provocations. They were sending
Yeah.
teams of agents inside the Soviet Union.
Mm.
Wow.
And they also
And
started-
we know, maybe not every listener does or viewer, that Carter was raised up for the nomination and the presidency under the auspices of Brzezinski and
Right, and
Rockefeller and the
Rockefeller, yes.
trilaterals.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So for the sake of the power and the
Right,
prestige of being
exactly.
president and
Right.
doing what good he could as president, it's easy to argue that he
Yeah.
paid the price by compromising. Like, you can do foreign affairs, I'll try to muscle through all I could in domestic. I don't want to get
Right.
too theoretical here,
Mhm.
but this team B, if I recall from your book, is the genesis of the neocons. No?
Absolutely. But
completely.
but that's why Brzezinski's ability to fulfill this drawing the Soviets to cross that border became the casus belli that empowered the neocons. To this day, they are still feasting off of the door that Brzezinski broke open.
Now, Brzezinski wasn't
Absolutely.
considered to be a neoconservative, but he was, in fact, I
He
asked,
was a Russophobe, though.
we asked Paul Warnke, I said, would you consider him to be a neoconservative? He said, well, pretty much. I mean, he satisfied all their needs, he said, but he was just a whole lot smarter than they were.
Yeah, and folks, I just another teaser for Paul and Liz's book, The Valediction, dropping in September. What Liz just said, he was a Russophobe, which has to do with his Polishness
Yes.
and the ancient roots of these
Right.
clashes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's all I'll say.
Yes.
Continue.
Okay.
They-
Yeah.
They go
Yeah,
back,
yeah.
many generations.
It's
They go
spectacular, but go ahead.
hundreds of
Well,
years.
I
And so does the Fitzgerald family involvement with this whole European.
I feel like we haven't even scratched the iceberg of the totality of not only all the stories you can tell, but their import, So maybe we can get back onto the spine of the narrative,
Okay.
because that's going to give us handles to think about and put into perspective what's been happening in Afghanistan since 1979, 1980, what the military is claiming to be in our name as the American people, what's happening right now, and then going into hopefully a wonderful future that we can influence the more people who know these stories.
Right.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's why I think interweaving what we came from with Hare and that experience and the reality of that.
And
the
we saw
belief.
it firsthand, how we could impact people.
That anti-war movement, folks, for people who don't remember, Chris Hedges, the award-winning journalist, investigative
Right.
reporter, tells the story of Nixon and Kissinger shoulder to shoulder at the White House windows, listening to the anti-war protesters
Right,
screaming
right.
and yelling, honking horns
Yeah.
outside, and Nixon saying to Kissinger, "They're going to come in here and lynch us." And Chris
Well-
Hedges commenting, "That's where you want your rulers to be." That's exactly
Yeah.
how leaders should
Right.
regard the power of a ferocious and knowledgeable and passionate people who
Right.
care about life and freedom. And that's why I resonate with the
Right.
stories you are telling.
Well, that's why you do have to constantly be vigilant and aware, but you also have to really know what really happened.
Yes.
And that's what we're trying to say. We don't know everything, but we know what we experienced, and we have tried to condense it enough so that we can give people a little bit of more of a foundation than they might have. I mean, people at this point in the United States, truly, most people think that Charlie Wilson's War is pretty much a good summary of the Soviet invasion and the US role. It's propaganda. What we did was the documentary that was a response to what the CBN was putting on about the SALT syndrome. They called it the SALT syndrome. We did our own documentary, which was an attempt to challenge that. But the real significance of having done that was that by the time we finished the documentary and it was ready to air, the Soviet invasion happened. Okay, so we're looking at trying to influence people to understand another perspective on why détente is important. We had John Kenneth Galbraith talking about the economic implications of not doing this and the devastating cost of the Vietnam War. And that's something I'm convinced most Americans do not understand fundamentally, that defense spending is not the same as spending on civilian spending. And this is what the whole SALT Treaty and détente was supposed to do, was to redirect a lot of the defense spending that people have been led to believe is no different, but that is not true. And their infrastructure and all the things people need to live, you know, the highways and the roadways and the systems and the libraries and the hospitals and all of that that need to be maintained have been completely deserted. Back then, because of the success of Brzezinski, we walked away from that reinvestment, and Reagan inaugurated the largest defense budget since World War II because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
And that investment in the infrastructures,
it never happened, and it still hasn't. We are still living with the crumbling infrastructure because of that shift right there.
So Bruce, you've got to look at the context of the time that we were doing this, okay? The American, or at least our impression at the time, was that, you know, that we could, as citizens of the United States, make change. We had some kind of ability to do it. It might have taken a lot of effort. You might have had to organize groups of people in order to make that change and influence the right people, but you could do it, okay? We could, at that time, put together a news story, take it to CBS News, and have them hire us to go and do it, okay?
We did have
and ABC and all the major, right. I mean, you had to, as I said, you had to do it correctly. If you did it correctly, you framed it correctly, you pitched it correctly, you could get it done, okay? And there were people out there doing that at the time. So we were inspired by some of those people. We did our documentary, Soviets Invade Afghanistan. And I said,
take a minute, please, and just describe the documentary.
The documentary was called Arms Race and the Economy, A Delicate Balance, okay? And what we did, this was the documentary that we did for Channel 25, a Christian Broadcasting Network outlet here in Boston, that would counter this thing called the SALT syndrome, this very conservative, pro-military, pro-big military budget. We went to John Kenneth Galbraith here in Cambridge, and we sat in his house for his living room for a couple of afternoons with a camera. And we just talked about what was going on with the budget and who these people were. And he gave us his in-depth background for having run the Office of Price Administration for Roosevelt during World War II, and then his tenure at Harvard University, and what he was an internet. Kennedy had made him ambassador to India, okay? We got to sit down with Paul Warnke, the man who had negotiated the SALT II agreement with the Soviets, and every single one of them said, spending more money right now with the country in the physical shape that it's in, with all the money that's been denied it, the infrastructure from the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, to go back and do it again, a World War II size military budget would be insane. Will ruin the country.
But the problem we were facing was that those people who were on the side of working with the Soviets were not capable of handling the style with which the neocons were capable of challenging them to prove that the Soviets weren't really evil. They weren't really going to do terrible things and try to take over the world. That's why when Brzezinski pulled off his Soviet invasion, President Carter was able to get up on television the night it happened and say, this is the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. President Carter actually knew that Brzezinski was intentionally provoking the Soviets. He was aware, he gave him the authority to you know, at all levels.
And Brzezinski had actually told him that that's what was going to do.
Yeah,
it's going to be very likely that what we're doing, and this was at least 6 months before, they had actually been doing it earlier than that. But Carter got involved.
This is completely counter to the official mainstream narrative.
Right, but knowing how singularly important this one event was, at stabbing, like almost stabbing to death, the possibility that the end of the Vietnam War and what we were hoping for, it literally was killed at that moment.
And Bruce,
by what Brzezinski did.
I'm sure you know the expression, the dog that didn't bark. Okay, and that's what this was all about. All these people on the so-called left who should have been upset about what was going on, what the right wing was doing was absolutely pro-military outrageous.
And totally, and if you looked at any of the claims,
Right.
there was no substantiation, and the kind of work we ultimately did over decades, okay, is totally exposed.
It's a perfidy. I don't know the accent where you put it.
Perfidy, yeah.
On par with the phony Gulf of Tonkin situation that enabled LBJ.
Absolutely.
So it takes the last patina of the shine of Carter's goodness. It really, really dips him in the worst of the worst. And in relief, we'll get right back to the narrative. In relief, it raises even higher John F. Kennedy.
Yes, it does. Absolutely.
But you find, as we discovered too, when we began to get involved with this, you weren't just fighting one group of people. The group got bigger and bigger. It became a mountain, and then the mountain became a mountain range. Okay, and that's what what happened when the door got kicked open in Afghanistan. Okay, they were looking. Brzezinski had been looking for some place to hang them up, to hold them there. I think initially they thought they could do it in Eastern Europe someplace. They were working on the kind of Orange Revolution type thing to go on.
That was
color revolution to go on to stimulate that in Eastern Europe, and they had tried doing it in the 50s and it failed miserably. They tried doing it again in the 60s, and they'd had a little bit here and there of success. Okay, but the Soviets had crushed it militarily. So they got into the 70s and they said, all right, we're going to play. Vietnam was over. All the cards were, it was a clean deck at that point. And they started, there were these people who were, it was called, the guy's name was Bennigsen. And his whole theory, he'd worked with British intelligence, and he came in and they said, look at you guys, you lost Vietnam. You didn't do a great job in Korea. You really need a whole new way of looking at this thing. You're an empire, and you've got to start naming the tunes that they're going to dance to. And that's when they come up with this whole concept of using the Islamic religion as a counterweight philosophy.
The fundamentalism,
the fundamentalist extremism.
As a handy thing to fight, to be at perpetual war with.
Right, exactly.
Well,
that's what they wanted to do. And that's what guys they put the guy that they put at the head of Team B, Richard Pipes, was the guy who was one of the theoreticians of this. It wasn't, what do they call it? Wasn't critical race theory at the time.
Nationalities working group?
Well, yeah, it was the nationalities working group, but it was to incite racial hatred amongst the Islamic nations below the Soviet Union.
Well, they were all
against white Russians. That was the whole objective.
The southern republics of the Soviet Union were all Muslim. And so that was what Brzezinski came into the Carter's administration initially to start by provoking those southern republics. And so that all became part of what eventually ended up in Afghanistan.
Nobody talks about that today. That was all done under sub rosa. That was all done behind the curtain.
Is this the right place to describe the CIA and the Saudis pouring fund and resources into Pakistan as an infiltration and a destabilization of Afghanistan? Or how do you want to, or do you want to talk about how you muscled in to do the first report from there?
Yeah, I think it's more about that, because the thing about the funding, Americans probably wouldn't think twice about the fact that the Saudis were financing this through Pakistan, because they have completely embraced the idea the Soviets really did invade this country, and whatever we had to do, so be it. This is the con job that's been very successful on the American people.
Can you take a minute, just a real brief, just to succinctly say why the Soviets came in? And this is the revelation from your book, that what we were doing funding through Pakistan, the Mujahideen, who we called the freedom fighters against the evil Soviets in Afghanistan, was the complete opposite of what we were told here in America, that we were embroiling Afghanistan in war. Take that.
That's it. That is it. And the connection, the CIA's connections to the Afghan opposition, to the Mujahideen, began with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud back in 1973. The United States,
long before the Soviets
the
had
fact is,
anything.
the United States wasn't concerned about the Afghan royal family becoming communists, needless to say. The Afghan royal family they were very reactionary, but they got along with the Russians. The Russians were their next door neighbor. They were their largest trading partner. The Russians had come in after World War II and paved the roads, and they built the bread factory in Kabul.
Hospitals,
schools, the whole thing. They trained them. They did all kinds of things. They had
and continued to do so through in the 1980s, as we're funding the forces that are blowing up the schools and the hospitals and the libraries.
And that was what I discovered after we got the permission to get in. All right.
That's why I had to read your book standing up. I couldn't believe what I was reading.
We got the permission to go in, and in 1981, I mean, after I left CBN, I left Christian Broadcast. We just parted companies in 1980. It was obvious Reagan was gonna go in after the Soviet invasion. It was like, there's no place for me to try to draw a line between the liberals and the conservatives because it was either one extreme or the other.
Okay, but I think the most important point we'd like to make, though, is what we witnessed was not just the insanity of the neocons and that agenda taking over, but it was the complete collapse of the supposed left. It was the complete collapse of the supposed ones who were for détente.
The left here in America. Yeah.
So it was as if everyone just said, well, the party's over. What do you mean the party's over? We knew instantly that the framing of the narrative was too quick, too neat, and it just stunk. So that was part of our attraction. But within the first month of the Soviet invasion, the Western media were kicked out. So what we were able to do was basically, within the next year, we were able to approach the people, Afghans, that we needed to approach to get the first visa as a journalist to get in. And we went in eventually for CBS News.
It was you guys, yeah.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the United States government never broke off relations with that government. They established relations with the Marxists when they took over in 1978 and established that relationship with them and said, whatever we have, we don't really have much relationship with you anyway. So we have a few programs here, educational programs, military transfer programs, whatever. We're going to continue that. The guy that took over for the Afghan government had been educated in the United States. He'd come to the United States twice. He admitted that the CIA had given him money, but told the KGB that he was just playing them along. Okay, he was using the CIA. The perception on behalf of the Russians was that he was a CIA agent.
Yeah.
Okay, whether he was or not is irrelevant. The fact is that the perception was there that he was. The fact is that he was probably in for his own particular interest. And the rumor was, which was put out in order to spook the Russians, because they had been so worked up by the destabilization prior to the Soviet invasion, to spook them into coming down, was that they kept offering them invitations. Oh, come in, we'll dress up Soviet soldiers as Afghan soldiers and come in and fight these guys, okay? And you can read the Politburo meetings of the Soviet leaders saying, this is ridiculous. This is a detective story. Brezhnev says at one point, what's going on down there? What the heck is this all about? They didn't know they were being played left and right prior to the Soviet invasion.
A little background, though, before you finish this story, that's important to understand. After the end of World War II, Pakistan was created out of 3/4 of Afghan land, okay? The United States basically picked Pakistan as its partner in the region and pretty much left Afghanistan for the Soviet Union. In fact, they were pretty much told, we don't want to have anything to do with you. You're in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. So a lot of the assumption that Americans have about this, quote, invasion and their role and all that, they don't understand that the history actually of their relationship and their influence has been a constant regular thing. And the US lack of involvement has been a constant regular thing. So it was very conveniently kind of ignored as a very important piece of understanding.
Are you saying that the Soviet Union coming in 79 was to help an ally or help a dependent?
Well, it was to stabilize it. They wanted actually at one point, Amin was a very destabilizing event. It was a bloody coup in 1978. They killed a lot of the Afghan royal family. It was something that, shocked, obviously, many of the, but yet he was supposedly became a Marxist in the United States. And while he was supposedly in a relationship at some level with the CIA, so one doesn't know exactly where this man stood.
Boy, oh boy, when something stinky happens, the CIA is always in it. Just like in the United States, something stinky happens, the FBI is somehow in it.
Yeah, right. Or any event that something happens, you find out that person was trained by the FBI.
It's all been manipulated.
Right. So Amin was a very compromised person in many ways. Okay, but nobody could quite nail him down. You know what I mean? So the Soviets were being kind of hands off at the beginning, but the destabilizing that was beginning. They were already beginning to start the destabilization from Pakistan. That was where you get your private funding, or the Saudis were there was coming in, and they were starting.
Pakistan was in the sphere of America,
right?
So
absolutely,
they don't really do anything that we don't either encourage or allow. Yeah.
Right. And also the fact that Pakistan basically wanted to neutralize the Afghan sovereignty, because they felt that they wanted, first of all, their big issue was India.
As Liz has said, 2/3 of what we look at in terms of Pakistan today used to be Afghanistan. If you watch Man Who Would Be King, Sean Connery is talking to
Michael Caine,
talking to the guy that plays Rudyard Kipling,
Christopher
Plummer. He says to him, he says, "Why, you can't go to Afghanistan?" He said, "You'll have to cross the Afghan plain in order to get to the Hindu Kush, to get over the mountains." Okay. And I thought to myself, now I saw this back in the 1970s, and I said, you'll have to cross the Afghan plain.
That's Pakistan now.
Afghanistan's on the other side of the Hindu Kush. Now, how would they have to cross coming from India? Well, you get into the history and you discover that what the British Empire did was, generation by generation, they moved the empire's boundaries up to the edge of the Hindu Kush. So when that story was written back in the 1860s, 1870s, Afghanistan was still on the other side of the Hindu Kush. So when the British Empire seized that part, what they did was they shut Afghanistan off from the ocean. They shut them off from the sea and from the fertile plain on the other side,
and created
which was
Pakistan.
fertilized by the Indus River.
Right.
And then when they divided up the empire in 1948, they established a separate military regime in Pakistan, Islamic military regime established by the British Empire in order to govern that region.
Yeah.
And so constantly, the Afghans went right to the United Nations and they said, you can't do this.
So
You
this is
promised,
really-
the British promised when they left the region that we would be able to take this and get our land back that you took in that agreement in 1898.
They lied.
And they said, the British said, well, it's not our problem now. We're
Right,
gone.
right.
We're out of
So
here.
this is all part of the lack of
Yeah.
historical knowledge that obviously makes it very easy for this propaganda campaign that was cooked up about the Soviets entering this poor little nation that was totally sovereign and perfect, and it was just this absolutely ruthless invasion where they obviously replaced a legitimate leader who suddenly became legitimate with their own leader. And so the framing of it missed some very important preconditions, like how many times the Soviets were asking the United States for assistance.
To do what?
For assistance in trying to stabilize things. They were trying to, they knew that something was happening, but they really didn't know the source of it.
The United States, Pakistan was an American ally during that time period and still a member of the British Commonwealth. So every time the Afghans would raise a fuss in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s about this land that the British was supposed to turn back over to Afghanistan, the Pakistanis would go to Washington and say, those communist Afghans are after our territory. They're trying to invade our territory. You have to support.
Well, they weren't communists early on.
So it went on. That sort of went on.
Then that became like the mainstream spin on that story.
Yes, that was their spin on it. But nobody really paid much attention to it in Washington
Afghanistan
in the
wasn't
1950s and
important.
60s, because the American focus was on Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
It was on Vietnam and Laos and
right.
Cambodia. Okay.
Okay.
So what happened is that after the Vietnam War and the United States gets kicked out of there militarily out of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, and all the drug operations in that part of the world, the drug operations decide to move from Southeast Asia to South Central Asia, to this no man's land on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is prime opium growing territory, not overseen by anybody except corruptible officials.
That's a whole other story. So
Yeah,
we're going
but
to
yeah, it is. But isn't that in some ways the fist inside the glove? It's the drugs.
Yeah.
It's that drug trafficking
Mhm.
that really dictates foreign policy, which is the theater show that governments put on and the media puts on. So thank you. You got into that plan of developing the production of the drugs in this region, Afghanistan, and moving it out through Pakistan.
Right.
Recall as well, Bruce, that the British Empire controlled the drug trade, had a monopoly on the drug trade out of India in the 19th century. Okay.
Yes. So what I'm saying about the drug trafficking being the fist inside the puppet show of current events, that goes back a century. So it's not just like we talked about through the conversation about the military industrial complex wanting to maintain its budget for all of its horrible, evil profit-making purposes. That's the tool of this drug trafficking.
Well, that's
fortunes that have been controlled for centuries.
Right.
Exactly.
And they do, that's where the black projects are all financed out of the drugs. But the important thing here about the tie-in to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was that he was the drug guy. Okay. That he was the one who was really provided early on with the access to the drugs and became well known as he got most of the money that was going to the Mujahideen.
And he was a strong figure in Afghan politics in these competing things in the late 70s, or?
No, he actually left Afghanistan in 1973 and started working with the Pakis against the Afghan royal family.
Thank you. Got it. Okay.
Okay. And so he was always, that's why when Hafizullah Amin and supposedly the drug kingpin of the Afghan Mujahideen were going to come together, that was part of the hysteria that the Soviets were reacting to, because that was all part of the centralizing the drug running right out of Afghanistan. But it was also bringing in the those who had been the fundamentalists who were the destabilizers, and they were very afraid of destabilizing Afghanistan. That was the real reason.
So the Soviets saw that drug business fueling these forces who were destabilizing the Muslim fundamentalists that had the backing of Pakistan, the United States, the CIA.
Yeah, I would think they might have known about that. I mean, that would strike me as
one would assume.
That they would have known about that. Yeah,
I mean, that was the that was
the
name of the game.
They didn't know about it, but the American people don't know about it. So I just want
to But the key to why the Soviets invaded was they were afraid of the destabilization that would spread into the Muslim republics of the Soviet Union. And if they got Afghanistan with Muslim fundamentalists right on that border, that's the reason they got tricked into invading. Along the way, they were willing to bring the king back to bring stability. So
the Soviets were trying to, their objectives were to spend 90 days in Afghanistan, stabilize the government, stabilize the situation, make sure the bad guys were taken care of, and then go back home. Okay.
And you got over there. What was the first year you got over there, Paul?
1981.
Right. And didn't you pretty quickly learn?
Oh,
Soviets want to get out.
On the ground.
And the rest of the 80s, America was subjected to the nonsense from the government and the media that, they're there to conquer the country and we've got to keep funding all these fighters, these freedom fighters.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And more. They were claiming, the Washington crowd was claiming that the Soviets were just using it as a base to conquer the Persian Gulf.
Right. That was
the whole objective was to take Persian Gulf oil.
And part of that was based on a phony CIA report that they were running out of oil. So, you had propaganda against propaganda.
There's a magazine article from it's about 1977. and it's called The Oily Americans. It's on Time Magazine. You can just Google it and you'll find it. Okay, it gives you the whole background of what was going on with this fake CIA report that they put out in 1977 of how the Soviets were running out of oil. And so that was used by the CIA and the internal people like Brzezinski as a motivation for what they were doing. So they already have their motivations written out. They've got the proof. They've got this phony thing. They say, oh, so they did this. So that's obviously what they want to do.
I just want to insert, because of the research I did for my book, to me, there is no underestimating the influence of the CIA in everything the American people hear and everything that's done to the American people and so many things around the world. There's no underestimate or overestimating.
Well, no, it was actually instituted. It was actually instituted in a document, 1953. It's called PSB-332. And you can get that on the CIA's website, actually.
Unbelievable.
PSB 332. And it talks about the establishment of a cultural war against the Soviet Union. We didn't have the kind of culture the way they had. They had an organized ideology that they could take into a country and convert people over to. We didn't have that kind of thing. So what they did was they created the cultural Cold War with this document. And it was completely totalitarian. They wanted to go into all these countries of Europe and replace the traditional European view in France and Germany and Scandinavia and wherever else, Italy, of their own histories, and replace it with something new, something modern.
The CIA was coaching American foreign policy to do this. The CIA had adopted that mission. Thank you.
It's all in PSB 332.
Yeah. Part of what happened to us was this revisit. I mean, after we went through our Afghanistan adventures, we took Roger Fisher in 1983, who was the head of the Harvard Negotiation Project, who absolutely was convinced and knew and had all kinds of documents to, support the fact the Soviets wanted to be negotiated out. We did it for ABC Nightline. It was obvious that the media had no interest in promoting or supporting this. It was not presented to the American people as a serious option. So it was killed, before it had a chance. And it was part of the proof that we got that trying to deal with this story based on more facts was not going to change the narrative that was coming out of Washington. So we had to reconsider everything.
Because it must have blown your minds to see the extent of the resistance of the...
Exactly. And it made it...
They don't want the truth. They don't want a good outcome. They don't want peace.
But what did they think they were doing, and why were they doing it? Well, it forced us at some point to ask ourselves, why did we do it? What do we think we were doing? And it made us have to think differently about how to get the other answer. And that's when we started writing the screenplays. And that's when we eventually ended up with Oliver Stone. And that's when we ended up discovering that, in truth, that Hollywood is definitely a dream factory. I mean, our dream life turned into a regular exchanges, feeling as if we really knew what was coming. We knew people we had never met. We certainly knew Oliver, but having a dream relationship that actually supports the reality gave us, once again, a lot to think about the reality of what is a dream and where does it fit into all of this. And that eventually...
Now you're describing something that takes which we're going to get into, and your work gets into, your book gets into, and the sequel, the next book's going to get into. And to me, this represents, just to paint a broad picture so folks can catch, what is she talking about? Dreams and reality. It's in a nutshell, for me, it's developing a spiritual imagination, because you study that and you practice and you do that enough, you come to a spiritual understanding or spiritual beliefs about the spiritual quality of reality and existence. So folks, if you're not there yet, listeners and viewers, hang in there. Just enjoy what Liz and Paul are going to talk about here and in their book. And I think, was that nice? That's a nice little umbrella. Okay, now.
Oh, excellent.
Now, what do we want, and how much longer do we want to talk in this video?